All right, you guys ready for this? You sent in Leviticus chapter 27, and, let's just say the ancient Israelites, they knew how to put a price on everything.
Oh, yeah. Talk about a deep dive. I mean, we're going deep into their spiritual and their economic world with this one.
No kidding. I mean, livestock, land, crops, you name it. They even put a value on people.
It's fascinating, really. It gives us a glimpse into how these two worlds, the spiritual and the economic, they are completely intertwined for them back then.
Right, because this is Leviticus, part of the Torah.
A foundational text for Judaism.
And it lays out this whole system that's, well, honestly, a bit shocking at first.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Definitely some eyebrow-raising stuff in there. But trust me, the more we dig into it, the more it'll make sense.
Okay, well, let's dig in then. And let's start with something that really jumped out at me. This whole thing about dedicating yourself or someone else to the Lord.
Like a spiritual vow.
Right. But then they went and put an actual monetary value on these individuals. It says right here, Leviticus 27.3, a man between 20 and 60 years old, 50 shekels.
And a quick reminder for anyone who's, not up on their ancient currency, a shekel, it was a unit of weight, but they also used it like money.
Okay, so like ounces of gold today or something.
Exactly. But hold on, because it gets, even more interesting. A woman of the same age, 30 shekels.
See, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's like, is this just a straight-up patriarchal society? What's the deal with that difference?
It's tempting to jump to that conclusion, I get it, but I think there's more nuance here than meets the eye.
Okay, so nuance, huh? Lay it on me. What's your take?
Well, think about it from a historical perspective. The roles men and women played in society back then were pretty different.
Okay, true. I mean, we can't just apply our modern-day lens to everything.
Right. So men were often the primary laborers, providers, protectors, all that. So their value could have been tied to, at least in part, their economic contribution.
Makes sense.
But, and this is important, don't forget the spiritual aspect.
Because this was a deeply spiritual society.
Absolutely. So their spiritual roles probably factored into this whole valuation thing, too. It's complicated, like most things in history,
Right. Nothing's ever black and white. But this whole idea of putting a price tag on people dedicated to the Lord, it just feels, I don't know, a little off.
I hear you. But I don't think it's about their lives literally being for sale. Think of it more like an assessment of their worth,
Worth in the context of this vow.
Exactly. And their potential contributions, both to the spiritual side of things, A&D, the material well-being of the community. It's about quantifying their commitment within their specific system.
Okay, so maybe we're not quite ready to, grab our pitchforks and start a protest just yet.
Yeah, no.
It's more complex than it seems at first glance, which, let's be honest, seems to be the theme of this entire deep dive.
It really is. And speaking of things that seem simple on the surface but are way more complicated underneath, let's talk about animals.
Animals.
Yeah.
Okay, bring on the goats.
Goats, sheep, cattle, the whole barnyard. But Leviticus gets very specific about the difference between clean and unclean animals.
Oh, yeah, right. Like what's kosher? What they could use for sacrifices.
Exactly. We're not talking hygiene here. This is about spiritual purity.
So I guess cheeseburgers were off the menu.
Not exactly. While those dietary laws are related, here it's all about what was fit for offering to the Lord. Clean animals, like your cattle and your sheep. They were seen as, wholly pure.
And if you dedicated one of those to the Lord, that was it. No takebacks.
No swaps allowed, according to Leviticus 27.910.
Okay, got it. So what if you had, a goat that wasn't exactly prime sacrifice material?
Well, that's where the unclean animals come in.
Give me some examples.
We're talking pigs, camels, those sorts of animals. And according to Leviticus 27.113, the priest would actually step in and assess the value.
So you could buy it back.
You could redeem it, yeah.
Yeah.
But with a little extra on top.
Extra? Like how much?
They had to add a fifth of the price on top. It's almost like a spiritual surcharge.
Hold on. So even when it comes to their spiritual practices, there's this economic element weaved right in. It's like they were running a whole spiritual economy alongside the regular one.
That's a fantastic observation. It really does suggest that the priests, they had this important role in, regulating these transactions and making sure everything was on the up and up.
And that extra fifth, where did that go?
Well, some scholars think it might have gone towards supporting the temple or, the priestly class themselves.
Ooh, interesting. Like a built-in system for, religious upkeep.
Exactly.
So we've covered people, we've covered animals. What about something a little more, permanent? What about real estate? How did they value houses and land in a world where you could just dedicate things to the Lord?
All right, well, just like those unclean animals, a house could be dedicated and then redeemed, with that same 1/5 extra.
Same deal. Got it.
But when we're talking land, that's when things get really interesting. It all comes down to this thing called the Jubilee year. And I gotta say, this concept, it might just blow your mind.
No. Hold on. Jubilee year. Sounds like something out of like a fantasy novel. What's the deal with that?
Think of it like a giant reset button. Every 50 years, boom. All debts are forgiven, slaves are freed, and here's the kicker, all the land goes back to its original owner.
Whoa. Are you serious? They had, like, a system to fight inequality built in thousands of years ago. Yeah. Okay, so tell me, how did this whole Jubilee thing, how did it affect the way they valued land?
All right, so picture this. You dedicate some land right before a Jubilee happens. Well, its value is going to be way lower than land that has, decades to go before that big reset.
It's all about the timing.
Exactly. And this whole system, as described in Leviticus 27.1625, it was meant to prevent something we still struggle with today.
Which is?
Land ending up permanently in the hands of just a few people. It's a pretty radical idea, even by today's standards.
You know what? You're right. Maybe we haven't progressed as much as we like to think we have.
Food for thought, right?
Big time. Okay, so they could dedicate people, they could dedicate animals, and they could dedicate land, but was there anything that was just totally off limits, like permanently dedicated to the Lord?
You're picking up what Leviticus is putting down. Yeah, chapter 27, verses 28 and 29, they talk about this exact thing. Permanent dedication.
So this is for the really important stuff.
The most holy to the Lord.
Yeah.
People, animals, land. And no matter how many shekels you had, you couldn't redeem them.
So it wasn't always about the money. Like, there was another layer to all this.
There was this layer of, complete and utter devotion to the divine. Things that were so sacred, no amount of money could buy them back.
Wow. When you think about what do we consider truly priceless today?
It really does. What do we hold so sacred that we wouldn't trade it for anything? That's something to ponder, right?
For sure. Okay, so we've covered people, animals, and land.
Mm-hmm.
But what about all the, everyday stuff? Did they have a system for that, too? It's really blowing my mind. It's just wild how these ancient practices can give us such a clear picture of, their whole worldview.
It's incredible, isn't it?
Each piece of this Leviticus puzzle, it's like it reveals a little more about how they lived, what they valued.
What they held sacred.
Exactly. And don't forget, this was a society where religion wasn't just like a Sunday thing. It was totally woven into everything.
Every aspect of their life.
Even their economy.
Absolutely.
And we've already seen that in how they valued people and animals and even land. But this Jubilee year, that's the thing that's really sticking with me.
Yes, the Jubilee.
This idea of like a giant reset every 50 years.
It's a powerful concept.
Debts are wiped clean. Land goes back to the original owner. I mean, it just seems so radical.
It was radical. And, it was so much more than just some kind of economic policy.
Oh, I bet. Tell me more. What was the deeper meaning behind this Jubilee year?
Well, imagine a society where land is the key to, everything.
Wealth, status.
Survival.
Yeah.
And over time, you can see how some families might fall into debt.
They might have to sell their land.
And end up trapped in poverty.
Which is something we see even today, right? Like wealth inequality.
It can be so deeply entrenched.
It's like the system's rigged against some people.
And that's where the Jubilee comes in.
Okay.
It acted as a safeguard against that very thing. Every 50 years, boom, clean slate.
Everyone gets a fresh start.
Debts are gone. Families can reclaim their ancestral land.
And that prevents this permanent concentration of wealth and power.
Exactly.
It wasn't just about economics. It was about, social justice.
Absolutely. Ensuring that everyone had a chance to thrive.
Not just the privileged few.
It's a profound idea.
And it really makes you think, do we have anything even remotely similar in our modern world?
That's the question, isn't it?
Because we don't have a literal Jubilee year. But are there any modern-day parallels?
I mean, think about movements for, debt relief.
Oh, yeah.
Or land redistribution programs.
Uh-huh.
Even those calling for a more equitable distribution of wealth.
Right. Because those all share that same underlying idea.
That we have a responsibility to address inequality.
To create systems where everyone can flourish.
The Jubilee serves as the powerful reminder that economic systems, they're not set in stone.
We have the power to change things.
To shape them in ways that reflect our values.
That's so inspiring. Okay, so we've talked about people, we've talked about animals, we've talked about land, and we've talked about this incredible concept of the Jubilee. But there's one more piece of this Leviticus puzzle that we need to explore, and that's the idea of tithing.
Ah, yes, tithing.
Giving a tenth of your produce and your livestock to the Lord. But as with everything else we've talked about today, I'm guessing there's more to it than meets the eye.
Always.
So what else can we learn from this practice?
Well, for one thing, it really highlights the importance of communal responsibility.
Okay.
Tithing, it wasn't just like a personal choice.
It was an obligation.
A way for each person to contribute to the well-being of the whole community.
Not just about individual piety, but about participating in a system of support.
Exactly. A system that provided for the religious class who, in turn, took care of the temple, performed the rituals, provided spiritual guidance.
So it was this reciprocal relationship, taking care of the community's needs, both spiritual and social.
Right. They built this kind of safety net into their society.
It's really amazing how they recognize the importance of taking care of each other.
And it's worth noting that the tithe, it wasn't just limited to produce. Leviticus 27.32 specifically mentions livestock.
So it wasn't just your extra veggies. It was a broader understanding of wealth and resources.
Your crops, your animals, all of it.
And it wasn't just like throwing a random assortment of stuff into a donation bin, right?
Not at all. The Leviticus 27.33 is very clear. You couldn't just pick and choose the best or worst animals for your tithe.
It had to be a true representation of what you had.
A true representation of your flock.
Emphasizing this idea of fairness and impartiality.
You couldn't just give the bare minimum.
You had to contribute honestly and proportionally.
And that makes me think about our own ideas about charity and giving today.
Because is it more about personal choice now?
Or do we still have that sense of collective responsibility for our communities?
Definitely something to think about.
Definitely.
This whole deep dive into Leviticus has been so eye-opening. I mean, who knew we'd find all these unexpected connections between economics, spirituality, and social responsibility in ancient Israel?
It really is fascinating, isn't it?
And the best part is, we're not done yet. When we come back, we'll wrap up our exploration of this fascinating chapter and leave you with some final food for thought. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been going deep, really deep into Leviticus chapter 27. It's all about valuations in ancient Israel,
Right.
like how they connected their spiritual and economic lives.
And yeah, it's been pretty fascinating to peel back all these layers, right? We've seen everything from valuing individuals, based on their age, their gender, to that wild concept of the Jubilee year.
Right, the Jubilee, I mean, talk about a
Yeah.
radical idea, right? But it just goes to show how this society was grappling with some pretty big questions.
Questions of fairness, justice, how they related to the divine. Questions we're still asking today, by the way.
Seriously. And they were trying to build a system that reflected like their values, their beliefs, all within this framework of, divine law. And it makes me think about how we often compartmentalize our lives.
Separate boxes for work, spirituality, finances.
Exactly. But maybe these ancient Israelites, maybe they were onto something with this whole integrated approach.
It's an interesting thought. For them, economic practices weren't separate from their spiritual beliefs. Everything was woven together,
Like two sides of the same coin.
Absolutely. Reflecting this worldview where everything was connected, part of a bigger picture.
A larger tapestry of meaning, like
Yeah.
you said. It really makes you wonder, though, are there any lessons we can take from all this?
Yeah.
Can we apply these principles to, our own lives, our own systems today?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, we can't just, plop a Jubilee year into the modern world.
Sure.
But the ideas behind it, the principles, economic fairness, preventing that concentration of wealth, giving everyone opportunities, those are timeless and more relevant now than ever, honestly.
Yeah, it's like their system was more like a blueprint, Not necessarily to be followed exactly, but to inspire us to think differently about, how we structure our society, how we relate to each other, our resources.
How we relate to the world around us.
Exactly. And even the idea of tithing, we often think of that as a religious thing.
Right, connected to institutions.
But maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's a model for giving back to the community, supporting those in need.
Recognizing that we're all in this together.
Our actions impact each other.
We have a responsibility to contribute to the well-being of others.
It's a powerful idea. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Leviticus chapter 27, I don't know about you, but I'm kind of left with a sense of, wonder.
And possibly.
Yeah, both. It's amazing how these ancient texts, they seem so distant, so irrelevant, but then they hit you with these insights that are so relevant to being human.
The quest for a just world, a fair world, it's still going on.
It's a journey.
And it needs both individual and collective action, maybe by looking back, way back, to the wisdom of the past.
We can figure out how to build a better future.
It's worth considering.
It has been quite the journey, this deep dive, exploring these connections, right, between economics, spirituality, social responsibility.
In ancient Israel.
Hopefully it's given you, our listeners, some things to think about, too.
Absolutely. Keep exploring these ideas.
Make those connections between then and now.
And think about how these practices can, maybe challenge us, inspire us to create a more just, more compassionate world today.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.